Okay. Welcome everyone to EDGEy Conversations. What a great conversation we're going to have today with Miriam Bowlby. And, in the church, we have often, and I think to our detriment, had such a hard separation between temporal and spiritual matters. We used to divide our governance that way between elders and stewards. However, in the biblical narrative, Jesus talked about two things most commonly: the reign of God and money. So we wonder why we did that. Who are we protecting? And in our own experience in EDGE, we've discovered in the last little while in particular, congregations are so in need of some creativity and capacity around sustainability of ministries, creativity. We've found great partners in the social enterprise movement around social transformation, and the Fresh Expressions movement has spawned enterprise or business forms of church. We would call them Fresh Expressions of Church. And in the midst of this context, we have Miriam Bowlby, who is a United Church minister in Newfoundland and has just completed an MBA program. And we're here to hear about that experience and what that's meaning for her in ministry. So, Miriam, tell us about this journey you've taken.
Oh, my pleasure. And it's not any MBA. I did an MBA in social enterprise and entrepreneurship. So it's a kind of highly specialized MBA here at Memorial University, which is kind of cool. To help you kind of understand why I went to the MBA route, I thought I'd tell you a little about me and my context and how I ended up deciding on this particular program. I've been ordained almost 20 years now, and I started in our rural 6-point pastoral charge in rural Newfoundland, beautiful place in Bonavista North, Newtown, Lumsden. And I found all the time they'd say, no, we can't try this new idea. We don't have any money. And I was like, I'm sure we can find the money. How do we get there? How do we make this program thrive? And over the years, I kind of got worn down of treasurers telling me we can't do innovative things because we don't have money. I thought, I need to learn how to read financial statements, and I need to know how to talk about money in new ways. So that was one of the things that kind of was in the back of my mind for many years. I've been in the minister here at Cochrane Street for the last 10 years. And when I arrived here, we had a whole bunch of things going on, but the biggest thing was they were spending between $50,000 and $60,000 a year on fuel. They had a building that they couldn't maintain. The city had come in and said, you have to do these 50, 60, 70 very expensive things in order to even keep the doors open. And the church ticked off all the kind of low budget cost ones, but putting a sprinkler system in a sanctuary was beyond the reach of a small congregation. It would have been hundreds of thousands of dollars plus other upgrades. So I am sure there are 100 other churches in that boat. And we tried a whole bunch of things and tried thinking about how we could change the trajectory on. And I'll mention this too, Rob, because you were instrumental in helping this happen. But I went to Greenbelt as part of the under 40 cohort. And there they talked so much, the speakers I went to talked so much about God's call to live in community and make communities where churches are better places. And churches were doing awesome things like opening schools and all these different things. And my experience in ministry was not necessarily geared towards social justice. I did a lot of Christian education ministry. I'm a godly play storyteller, things like that. And social justice, while it was important, wasn't that. But when I went to Greenbelt, I thought, no, we need to start getting involved in our communities more and making a difference in people's lives in that way. And that's how Cochrane Street, in some ways, started down that road. And then we started our own project to redevelop the building. And it came as a call from the government for supportive housing. So that's, in some ways, the building where I am is a great mix. It's got It's a social enterprise. It's a building that's run by the Cochrane Center Board, and there's a management agreement with First Light, which is an urban indigenous organization. There's small businesses in the building. So we've got this thriving space. This week is Spirit Song Festival, which is a festival that highlights Indigenous arts and artists. So the church lives here, First Light lives here. There's 15 tenants, both seniors and supportive housing, who live here. So there's a real sense of community here. The journey through to getting there was another reason why I wanted to do an MBA, because I thought, how can churches keep making a difference in community? And it kept coming back to the skill set that we get from the business world. We need to know so many things about how to read financial statements. I think the church could do so much of a better story about telling our story about the great things that churches do in communities, that we go about quietly and we, don't talk about the amazing work we do in community. Loneliness is a huge problem. And here we are, churches, and we have built-in community and we could do so much good for people that way, but we kind of quietly go about our business. I remember the first year at Christmas time, I paid for a Facebook ad for the church to try and encourage people to come to church. And I did so kind of like, will I get in trouble? Like, can we use this? Like, is the church allowed to advertise? So there's lots of things we can learn from business about how to tell our stories, but social media is one of them. How can we use our buildings to make our communities around us sustainable? At some point down the road, we're going to have more church buildings than we can use as churches. But how many different enterprises or community services can we put into buildings? I cry a little every time we sell a building. I really think we should be figuring out how they can be repurposed to serve the community. So those are some of the reasons I wanted to do the MBA. When it came to choosing the program, that was a little harder because a lot of the MBAs out there, I thought, how do they line up with what I want to do as the church? So when Memorial University started talking about an MBA in social enterprise, I thought, that's a degree I can get behind, because social enterprise is all about the triple bottom line. Profit, still making money, but serving people and planet too. And that is something that really interests me. We did courses in that program around sustainable capitalism. So asking the question, how can we make this capitalism work for everyone, for the planet, for people, and still be living sustainably on this planet? And I started, when I did that course, a file called Gospel Economics, because I really think the things that Jesus talked about and sustainable capitalism line up really nicely, because we talk about how do we bring good news to the poor? Well, living wage, which changes how we operate, is a way to bring good news to the poor because it lifts everybody up. We talked a lot about the things that we measure, and when GDP, gross domestic product, is the only thing we measure instead of well-being of people who are living in the places, then we're kind of missing the mark, and we're not really measuring the full breadth of what happens in society. And so that was sustainable capitalism, but everything we did in the course was geared towards how to make things work for businesses, for the planet, and for people around us. And in my class, were all sorts of people. We were the first cohort, so we're the first 14 people to do this degree program. And there were people who were running Cloudberry Forest School, which is a forest school that helps kids get outdoors and how to make that business sustainable. Another classmate's working on co-housing. there were three of us with religious backgrounds. So my friend Kendall in the class had done a Bachelor of Theology at Tyndale and was wondering how to make church and social enterprise work together. And my friend Bio from Nigeria wants to, and has a computer science background, but he wants to develop apps for churches to help them work better. So a really diverse background of people in the class, all trying in their own way to make the planet a better place. One of the things when I was talking to Carla about what I learned and how I'm different, I joked with her is in our leadership course, we had to have, an experience that put us out of our comfort zone, a crucible experience. So I said, I went to do my MBA and I learned how to preach without notes. So it affected everything.
Wow.
Yeah. We had to do this thing that made us afraid. And I've always been a text-driven preacher. And so I said, well, what I'll do is I'll preach without notes and see what I learn. And so it's affected everything about how I do worship and ministry in good ways. So preaching out without notes has been one of the things, and that's about learning my leadership style. It was about learning about myself, about trusting myself.
Mm-hmm.
So that was part of the MBA experience. I go to board meetings differently because we had to learn about governance structures, how you decide roles within those governance structures. I talk about finances and money in the church differently. I'd already been on the journey where we couldn't just put money in a separate pot and say, we can't talk about that because we're in church, but really opening up the conversation around money. And COVID-19 in many ways has forced every church to talk about money because we have to have people giving in new ways. I'd been talking about, e-transfers for many years, but now all of a sudden we have the capacity in our congregation to do e-transfers, and we take credit cards. So talking about money in open ways has been a really, really part of it. I think another side benefit has been looking at, I plan more in advance because I look at the seasons. So I've spent the better part of the last 2 weeks looking at the Christmas season because I think Christmas is the time, if ever someone's going to come to church, in some ways, Christmas is that opening. So how can we engage the whole community around us in this celebration? Because people are, this is a challenging year for people. So planning around that, how it looks on our website, matching how it looks on our social media, and making sure we're all streamlined that way, and that the themes in worship match the themes that we're putting out in the public. So it's kind of worship and advertising all at the one time. I know we wouldn't want to call it advertising in the church, but making sure we're all lined up and planning better that way. And as I think about the future and what I hope to do, I think with the new skill set, I feel I've got I call it a translator role. I really think that the MBA has given me the ability to kind of straddle two worlds that don't usually go together. So if I'm in a business crowd, I can talk the business and I understand the language of business. And when I'm in the church, I can help them understand in new ways the language of business, but I can also talk to the business people and help them understand the language of church and help facilitate conversations better. So one of the things that I hope to do is find a way to work with congregations that are closing or wanting to do something different and help them talk with businesses and community leaders so that maybe something good can come out of the closure of a church rather than just selling a building. The experience at Cochrane here was the last thing they wanted with their building that had served the community for so long was for it to become condos for private people to live in. And so helping other churches do that kind of work is something that really interests me and a skill set I have now. So there's been lots of really kind of exciting benefits of this mishmash of business and church. But I really think if we can find a way to keep the doorways open, it really is going to benefit the church, but it's also going to benefit the business world, as businesses now are even if they're not a social enterprise, are still having to line up around environmental goals and goals around how they treat employees and how they reach out into the community. So we can have some more interesting conversations in the future with business people who also want to do good work in the community, and how can we work together for that. So there's my 2 cents worth. I don't know if I took 20 minutes, but
I'm guessing
there's my thoughts.
if that's 2 cents, the return on investment is pretty amazing. That was great.
Well,
Go ahead.
I should say too, thank you to the United Church of Canada Foundation, who helped pay for some of my tuition, because MBAs are very expensive. So they've been very supportive along the way as a region.
That's so good to hear. I just think this is such an important area of exploration. Like for me, God's up to something in reintegrating and bringing wholeness back to a world, a view that we've kind of compartmentalized in many ways, and that there's huge opportunity. And so there are, but we're not there yet. Generally, people aren't there yet. So I'm a little curious about your experience of how people, like, for example, housing. Housing in a church development scenario is probably the most common single element of a development. And I have had senior church people who I deeply respect, deeply faithful and theologically, grounded, saying, "But what does that have to do with church?" What?
I would say everything.
Well, yes. What do you say? What do you say? And have you encountered that?
I'm fortunate in the congregation that I serve that no one asked that question. Wow. What does this have to do with church? Because they've always been committed to outreach. Now, part of that is Stella Burry, the deaconess who bears the name of Stella's Circle, which is one of our kind of United Church key outreach agencies, attended this church. And I think it left a lasting impact on the congregation. So there was already a sense of importance in helping people built into kind of the DNA of this particular congregation. But I think it has everything to do with living in faith, because Jesus talked about how we care for the widows and orphans, how we care for people in our community. Whenever you do it to the least of these, you do it to me. So I think about following Jesus as and I think about housing as an expression of our faith, because if you haven't got a safe, affordable place to live, then what can you do? You can't get jobs. You can't you can't integrate back into society if you've lost jobs and housing because of addiction or depression or mental illness. Or sometimes a lot of people in our society now are one paycheck away from being homeless. So it could be any one of us. So I think it has everything to do with faith. And I'm sorry, that's the office phone, and it's ringing.
we're all familiar with that. Yeah, we're all familiar with that. I think you are fortunate, and probably a sign of good leadership in the congregation there. Certainly the connection with Stella Burry. I often want to say to people, well, because people think of the Sunday morning as church, right? Mm. And I want to say to them, well, if your Sunday morning isn't giving birth to affordable housing when there are people that don't have it and are in poverty because of it in your neighborhood, then what does your worship have to do with church?
I had people ask me that if we did this, would we see more people come to church on Sunday morning? And I said, no. I said, and that's not why we're doing it.
Although I wouldn't rule it out necessarily.
I wouldn't rule it out. And there have been people who've joined because they think we're doing innovative things and good work in the community. It is an attraction, but I don't think the two are. I think the motivation behind why you do it matters. If you do it simply because you want to increase your Sunday morning attendance, then maybe it's a bit.
People smell motivation from a mile away. Like this is
Yeah.
your generation grew up in a mass media marketing society. We've
Yeah.
learned some things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And they know when it's genuine care for other people.
Yeah.
Um, so, and you walk into our building now, it's not really our building because we've signed over the building to Cochrane Center, and you can feel the community in the place.
Wow.
Some nights you walk in for choir practice and they've had yoga offered by Furt's Light, and they've done a smudge before, so you can smell the sweetgrass as people go in for choir practice. So there's a certain beauty in the development. And I think that is attractive to people, but it may not be the only reason why they come to church on Sunday.
In the preamble of the United Church Song of Faith, there is a clearly articulated mandate of the church to explore alternative economic arrangements and relationships because of the oppressive nature of our current capitalist system, particularly for people without capital. um, and here is this course that you're taking, right? And how often does the church actually embody alternative economic models? We because we don't even talk about it. That's business. That's not church.
Yeah.
And yet here's this course, kind of on sustainable capitalism, that is trying to bring the two together. For you, it's gospel economics.
Yeah.
So there, I just get this sense of you're bringing faith to the School of Business, and the School of Business is bringing alternative models to that kind of help us embody our faith. How has your experience been of that coming together, and where do you see it going? Like, it just seems like God's up to something bigger than both the academic institution and the church, and is calling us together to get there. What do you see happening there?
I think there's lots of really interesting things happening in the world, um, in terms of everybody living more justly in the world together. I think the pressures on companies and businesses to do business differently, to do it in ways that not reduce the harm to the planet, and increase people's well-beings. And you see that in the number, and I'm going to forget the name of it, but there's a certification for companies that act in environmentally friendly ways. And I think that's changing how businesses operate, because now it's going to become the gold standard of how they have to operate. And I looked even at the conversation since COVID-19 happened around a living wage. So people, living wage or minimum incomes, whatever you want to call it, guaranteed income. And I think that's one way that the conversation has changed, because I don't think 10 years ago people would have been talking about how to make it so everybody can have a sense of well-being. And in our sustainable economics, there's been there were several studies showed to us, like about the you hit a certain level of wealth, of personal wealth, and above that, your happiness and well-being doesn't generally increase. So what is it we need for our well-being? How can we live? And I think it impacts our faith when we ask ourselves questions like, what do we need for our own well-being? Faith is part of that, but also when your neighbor isn't doing well, how can you be doing well? When people who are connected to us are suffering and don't have homes, or have no resources to pay for basics like food, how can we feel content with ourselves? And part of what God is up to, I think, is pushing churches, businesses, everyone, to make sure that all God's people are taken care of around the world, and that everybody has an increased sense of well-being. One of the things I always found striking is the level of income needed to increase that sense of well-being. In particular, there were studies in developing countries where the smallest increase in wealth actually increased the sense of well-being by staggering levels. So I think God is up to something and pushing people to do better for others. Even this week, there was, I heard on the news now, in Newfoundland and Labrador, Loblaws has had all the stores shut down because the employees been on strike because they lost their pay. And one of the commentators, when Loblaws increased their dividends to their shareholders, one writer said, it would have been better to pay the essential workers, continue paying the essential workers their $2 above an average of kind of danger pay for being there in COVID than increasing dividends to shareholders. We know if we ever heard that talked about. Like, that's a new kind of conversation that's happening, I think. When I heard it, my ears perked up, and I thought, that's sustainable capitalism. And maybe in the church, if we started talking about how we can change our structures in the world, in our worship and in our meetings, and as a people lobbying for a different economic structure, I think it's going to change the world for the better for everybody.
God's up to something indeed, and I hear that in the world and in the for-profit and certainly in the church, but also as I heard your story of how you got into this, I have an excuse for my MBA. This was before I felt a call to ministry, but you kind of came to this through your calling in the gospel. And so God's up to something in you. What is the horizon of that? Like, what are you experiencing happening? And what would you say to other United Church leaders that might be having similar experiences?
Go get your MBA. For me, it was a really positive experience, and I felt strongly that this is where God was calling me. I have a question mark about exactly how I'm going to be putting it to use. God hasn't pointed that quite out yet. In some ways, God's a little tricky, but I know that I'm using the skills I already have, and what next for me, I don't know, but I do know that it's changed how I do ministry. And I know it's not to be a work outside the church. Like, I'm not going to be going and working in a company doing their corporate goodwill work. Like, that's not where God is calling me. God is calling me to use these skills for the church. I really believe that in this moment, people are searching for something. And we have a message in the church that people need to hear, and how we share that and how we say it is really going to transform people's lives. And that I know that's part of where God is calling me. How can we make the biggest difference in people's lives for the better possible? And some of that is sharing our faith stories. Some of that is picking up the old skill that we lost somewhere along the way in church, of testimony, of saying why it matters that we believe in God and that we follow Jesus, and how that impacts our lives, and sharing that with other people, and helping the people in the pews talk about their faith in ways that says, there's something valuable and important here. Come join me in it.
And the need is great right now.
And the need is great, especially now.
Yeah.
Right now I think there's a spiritual hungering right now.
Loneliness was already a pandemic before COVID, and it's how tragic with all of this connection technology, unprecedented, and yet people are dying of loneliness. I think God is already putting to use your MBA, Miriam, in this wonderful kind of sharing of your story, and thank you for sharing it. Also, I know from a conversation from, I can't remember her name now, but the dean of the MBA program, and
Natalie Slowinski.
Natalie, and they also have experienced the benefit of this calling just in your presence and what you bring of gospel economics into the program, and she was looking for other people like you to get into the program. So isn't that wonderful? And I trust really, really exciting things ahead. Thank you for this. I suspect there may be some people wanting to get a hold of you when they hear this, because you've been very fortunate to be able to do this, but it's a daunting thing for many people, and some company along the way can't be harmful at all. So thank you so much.
Feel free to call or email.